Today we're talking about the turbulent and intense history of the 101st Airborne Division. We'll take you through its dark warpath and share some of the most horrific missions that earned this unit a special place in military history. Let's begin. Seeing the success of German paratroopers during blitzkrieg tactics early in World War II, the United States decided to create its own elite airborne units. The idea was for paratroopers to jump behind enemy lines, disrupt and confuse their defenses, or capture key objectives and hold them until the main force arrived. This allowed attacks from unexpected directions and was a highly effective tactic in many missions. However, some of them went horrifically wrong for the paratroopers. We'll get to them in a moment. Taking the legendary eagle emblem of the Civil War, the division got its iconic insignia as well as the nickname Screaming Eagles. The unit was activated in August 1942 and quickly began selecting and rigorously training soldiers. They were looking for a special type of men capable of staying calm in the chaos of airborne operations. Besides being physically and mentally fit, these soldiers had to adapt quickly to all the surprises that could arise during such operations. Expected to operate independently in small groups deep in hostile territory, they were trained to handle all types of weapons, including those of the enemy, as well as hand-to-hand combat, explosives, setting traps and ambushes, and surviving on their own behind enemy lines. Training accidents were not uncommon, sometimes resulting in fatalities, and it was normal for about 10% of soldiers to be hospitalized after parachute jump drills. Crawling through mud mixed with slaughterhouse remains with live machine gun fire just 18 inches off the ground was one of many creative methods used to prepare these men for the nearly impossible missions ahead. First in the United States and then in Britain, the paratroopers of the 101st trained relentlessly for a huge secret mission that everyone knew was coming. However, no one knew exactly when, where, or how bad it was going to be. They were about to see combat for the first time, leading the largest military operation in history. Operation Overlord had an expected casualty rate for paratroopers of a terrifying 80%. Their task was to jump behind German lines, secure key objectives, and disrupt enemy reinforcements so the main invasion force on the beaches wouldn't be pushed back into the sea. The operation began with a massive airborne assault. Among many others, 6,700 Screaming Eagles were aboard C-47 transport aircraft. The first to jump were the Pathfinders to mark the landing zones using signal lights and radar beacons. However, thick clouds, poor visibility, and heavy German anti-aircraft fire created complete chaos. As the main body of the 101st approached the drop zones, they flew straight into a cloud of German flak. With experienced pilots assigned to bombing missions, many transport pilots who had never seen combat were responsible for delivering the paratroopers. Under horrific anti-aircraft fire, many pilots panicked and broke formation. Hundreds of paratroopers were dropped too early, too low, or at dangerously high speeds. Most of the 101st landed scattered across the Normandy countryside, miles away from their intended drop zones and objectives. Some ended up in the English Channel, landed directly atop German positions, or flew straight into burning buildings on the ground. The 101st alone lost nearly 1,000 men. Still, once on the ground, the paratroopers quickly began gathering and organizing themselves. They used crickets, simple click devices to identify each other in the dark without revealing their positions. One paratrooper would challenge the other with one click, and the other had to respond with 2 clicks. If there was no answer, it was likely the enemy. However, many paratroopers lost their crickets during the jump. They risked being shot by friendly troops or having to shout out that they were Americans, giving away their position to the enemy. Lightly armed paratroopers fought off German tanks, artillery and machine guns pouring in from all sides. They held out for 2 full days until armor and reinforcements arrived. Even though they were promised to be replaced after 3 days of hard fighting, this turned into 33 days of heavy combat as the Germans tried to push the Allies back. By the end of the Normandy campaign, 1 out of every 4 paratroopers had been killed or wounded. Still, for their first time in battle, they surpassed all expectations. But this was only the beginning. After their success in Normandy, the Screaming Eagles would soon have to jump behind enemy lines again, leading another ambitious mission. This time, the largest airborne operation in history. Along with British and Polish paratroopers, they were dropped behind German lines in Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. Their mission was to seize key bridges and crossroads and hold them until the main force with tanks could arrive. At first, they surprised the Germans and captured most of their targets, but a strong German counterattack soon began. The British tanks meant to support them were delayed, and once again, what was planned as a 3-day operation turned into a 72-day battle with horrific losses before the 101st was finally pulled out. Though they achieved most of their objectives, the operation as a whole was a costly failure. After suffering heavy losses, the Screaming Eagles returned to France for a well-deserved rest and reorganization. However, their short break ended in December, when the German army launched a massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes. The major attack, spearheaded by heavy tanks, pushed the Allies back 65 miles and set the stage for the horrific Battle of the Bulge. All available troops were called in to stop the German advance, and of course, the 101st was among the first. But since they didn't expect any missions so soon, the Eagles weren't armed or equipped, and worst of all, they were still wearing summer uniforms. 12,000 paratroopers were loaded into trucks and rushed toward the front lines. As they passed shattered Allied units falling back with the Germans close behind, the paratroopers gathered whatever weapons and ammunition they could from the retreating soldiers and ran directly at the main German force. It didn't take long before they met them, around the town of Bastogne, which they were ordered to hold at all costs. In the horrific battle that followed, the paratroopers somehow managed to hold the line, but they were quickly surrounded by German forces. They endured constant heavy artillery fire and attacks, all while freezing in their summer uniforms. With bad weather grounding supply planes, many soldiers suffered from frostbite and hypothermia. The conditions were nearly impossible to endure. By the 5th day of the siege, the Germans assumed the Americans had finally had enough. They sent a letter demanding surrender, threatening complete destruction by artillery if they refused. That's when the 101st Command gave their now famous one-word reply: nuts. The Germans couldn't even understand it at first. By repositioning their artillery and forces to defend only the most critical areas, the Americans made the Germans believe they were much stronger than they actually were. Just before Christmas, the weather cleared enough for Allied air support and much-needed supplies, slightly relieving them until General Patton's army finally broke the siege and reached the 101st. After that, the Eagles fought alongside the American 1st and 3rd Armies, helping push the Germans back and win the war. After World War II, the 101st was deactivated, but only for a brief period. In 1956, the 101st was reactivated as tensions escalated during the Cold War. Little did they know they would soon be fighting on the other side of the world, in conditions never seen before, in the Vietnam War. Here, they transitioned from parachuting to being air mobile, a new concept where they were flown directly into combat zones by helicopters, which came to define this war. Once again, they proved their worth, and their patch earned respect, even from the enemy. When the army ordered patches to be toned down for camouflage, the Screaming Eagles were the only unit granted an exception. At first, they mostly conducted long-range reconnaissance patrols, sending small teams deep behind enemy lines for a couple of days to gather intelligence and, ideally, leave undetected. Soon, the entire 101st Airborne Division was deployed to Vietnam. Shortly after their arrival, they were hit by the Tet Offensive, a massive and coordinated series of attacks launched by the Viet Cong across South Vietnam. Then, the 101st was sent into the A Shau Valley to attack a heavily fortified position known as Hill 937, later becoming infamous as Hamburger Hill. The hill was heavily defended by the Viet Cong, with bunkers and connecting trenches that withstood even the heaviest bombardments. Despite airstrikes and artillery, most of the North Vietnamese forces survived, waiting for the ground assault. For 10 grueling days, the Screaming Eagles, among others, were ordered to repeatedly assault the hill, charging uphill across open ground with no cover, straight into enemy machine gun fire. Hamburger Hill was taken at a devastating cost. Some companies suffered casualty rates of 150%, meaning that the number of killed and wounded exceeded the original strength of the unit, due to constant reinforcements being sent into the battle. Despite the staggering losses, the 101st continued to serve until the end of the war, living up to the reputation it had earned during World War II. After Vietnam, the Screaming Eagles were reorganized and officially renamed the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault. They trained extensively to work with advanced UH-60 Black Hawk and AH-64 Apache helicopters. Before long, they were called upon again to lead operations that would set new standards and records. During Operation Desert Storm, as the war in Iraq intensified, the Screaming Eagles conducted the longest helicopter-borne assault in history, flying more than 155 miles to establish forward operating bases. 8 of the division's Apache helicopters were the first to cross into Iraq, destroying radar systems to clear the way for bombers. They continued launching air assaults and disrupting Iraqi forces deep within enemy territory. After Desert Storm, the 101st continued to play a leading role in major conflicts and missions around the world. Following the 9/11 attacks, the division was deployed to Afghanistan, using its expert air assault tactics against Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces in the remote mountainous terrain. In 2003, the 101st took part in the invasion of Iraq, capturing key cities like Najaf and Mosul, engaging in intense urban battles and helping secure Baghdad. They also played an important role in missions like the hunt for Saddam Hussein. Today, the 101st remains one of the most versatile and capable units in the US Army, ready to deploy anywhere in the world.